Again, like other countries, people with disabilities receiving a poor service of service, lack of availability of wheelchair accessible vehicles, and 44% of full-time wheelchair users have been refused service to just 7.7% of the general population. In 2008, following the economic review, we found that there were 100 million cabs trips taken, which was a quarter more than 2005. And even though things have quietened down in Ireland, still cab trips are taken above that of bus and train trips as well. So at the moment we have our latest research from the summer where 68% of people are using taxis over about 60% who would use buses and trains. People with disabilities, our objective is to get 10% of the fleet accessible. I suppose the programme for government some years ago was that we might turn the whole fleet into an accessible fleet, but realistically that was too costly in terms of the size of the vehicles and particularly the investment that would be required by drivers. So our objective is to have 10% of our fleet accessible. At the moment we've got about 6% of the fleet accessible. The disability groups would like to see 20% of the fleet accessible, but what we hope to do is certainly over the next number of years at least to get to that 10% and then review the situation at that time. However, to get to that 10%, again, we're in the situation the same as many other countries of the cost of the vehicles. So we've made several submissions to the Department of Transport for financial assistance to, first of all, upgrade the current fleet, which we have, which is about 1,500 accessible vehicles, and then also to try and get ourselves to that 10% fleet in the future. So to look at all of the kind of costs and benefits and the ways in which government could address the financial assistance, we put together a full regulatory impact analysis and provided that to government, and we're waiting for some sort of a response at this point in time. But in the meantime, with our new reform package which rolled out for wheelchair accessible vehicles this year, we have introduced a new category of wheelchair accessible hackney which will be able to service some of the rural areas. And also we've put in new regulations in place where operators with wheelchair accessible vehicles must prioritise services to people with disabilities. We found in the past that because of the reduced licence fee for wheelchair accessible vehicles, that people would go out, they would buy a wheelchair accessible vehicle, but they wouldn't service people with disabilities. In fact, what they do is they go off to the airport and fill it with 8 passengers and 8 sets of golf clubs, etc., etc. So we put regulations in place which requires them to keep all bookings recorded, and our enforcement team then can make spot checks to ensure that priority is being given to the people that should be getting the service. We also have a wheelchair accessible register in place where all wheelchair accessible licence holders must register with us, give us all of our details, so we hold their contact details and also their hours of operation, so that when people with disabilities telephone our consumer line, they can then access a service and find out where the service is in their local area and what the times of operation are. We've no additional charges for mobility aids or assistant dogs, and also we've included in our skills development manual disability awareness training for drivers designed with input from people with disabilities. We were looking at the investigation of and the extension of travel concessions for people with disabilities, such as which is in the UK at the moment, where you could have some sort of a voucher scheme where people with disabilities could use possibly taxis once or twice a week so they could get to and from their destinations. We've explored that with the Department of Social Protection. Yet they're not giving in to us, but we're going to keep the pressure on. We're also looking at tactile and braille licensing number for people with disabilities, so that when they get into the vehicle, they will also be quite sure that they're travelling in a licensed vehicle. And all our Commission publications are available also in a variety of formats. So the effects then of liberalisation on industry is quite different than it is on consumers. Drivers are working longer hours to achieve their income targets. There's no doubt that they're working much, much longer hours, and in fact recent research over the summer period here, because of a reduction in demand due to the economic downturn, drivers are reporting that it's getting a bit tougher out there for them. Earnings are less and longer hours to achieve it. Our 2008 survey showed that full-time Dublin taxi drivers were experiencing a real earnings, reduction of about 5%, and our recent research this year has showed that to increase to about 20%. Enforcement activities, however, have indicated low levels of non-compliance, but there is an increased level of fair price competition out there, And dispatch operators in particular in Dublin City at the moment are offering 20% discounts to try and get some more consumers to use the services. So there's a significant decline in the number of active licence holders, as well as the market reaches an equilibrium, and I'll show you that in some of the statistical information at the end of the presentation. So for industry members then, in engagement with the Commission, they have a wide range of services available to them. We've got a dedicated industry information line, and you will see from the statistical information that I'll show you at the end of the presentation how many calls we actually get from the industry. We also have a website, and we have that divided into consumer and industry, so a lot of information available there. Publications, which I mentioned earlier, industry newsletters, strategy statements, action plans, corporate publications, regulatory impact assessments, information guides, etc. We also try and promote the use of services by a lot of awareness campaigns, and we use those awareness campaigns around large events where there's going to be a lot of taxis in use, and also around festivities. Particular, we'll give you an example. When it's coming up to Christmas, we'll always do a joint awareness campaign with the Road Safety Authority, and the message out there jointly will be: don't drink and drive, use a taxi, use a hackney, and if you can afford it, use a limousine. And we also promote vehicle licensing services, dispatch operator licensing services, driver identity cards, and we have a compliance hotline for the industry as well. So as I mentioned earlier, our next reform package, 2010-2014, our strategic objectives are to continue to develop and maintain the regulatory framework for the small public service vehicle industry in Ireland, and to facilitate access to high quality services by all users, in particular people with disabilities. Enhance quality assurance for small public service vehicle users and service providers, and partner and engage with stakeholders in order to progress strategy and strategic objectives. So it is very, very important for us to continue to partner with the industry as we roll out new reforms. And then, as I mentioned earlier, very, very important again to promote the integration of the services into the wider transport system. So evolution of the regulation of the industry. There's a list on your left-hand side there. You can see what was the situation prior to liberalisation, and on the right-hand side you can see the difference since liberalisation. So we had inadequate supply, which has now been addressed by good supply and increased competition. We had long waiting times. Now we've got satisfied customers with short or in fact no waiting times. We had a large number of licensing authorities. We've now got one national licensing authority. We had different taxi fares and different taximeter areas. We've now got one national taximeter area and one national fare. Lack of understanding relative to inadequate awareness. We've now got consumer awareness, in-vehicle information, dedicated hotlines and website. We did have a poor service for people with disabilities. We have an increased supply of wheelchair accessible vehicles, and then we're rolling out the new specifications this year. The industry would have said that there was inadequate enforcement. With our now dedicated enforcement team and planned operations with the police force, etc., we've now got stronger enforcement for the industry. In the past, there was no ongoing change looking at vehicle standards. We're now looking at vehicle standards. We've published vehicle standards, and we'll be revisiting them every 5 years. Again, in the past, no up-to-date training for the industry, and we've now introduced the new skills development programme that I mentioned earlier. No licensing for dispatch operators in the past. We've now put the licensing requirements in place for dispatch operators. And again, inadequate register of licences, because there were various registers held by the Gardaí and local authorities around the country. We've now got one national register of licences available to the public. Inaccessible publications. All our publications are in accessible format, and we now have a centralised website, www.taxiregulator.ie, which has a variety of information available.